Hello, team, and welcome to week 8. I hope you're all going well and that you had a little break, at least from the in-person tutorials during week 7, and you're back and rearing to go for this week's upcoming tutorials. I apologize, I don't have video on for this lecture because I'm currently just in Istanbul and recording this in the evening, and for some reason my hotel room doesn't have a big light, so I'm in pitch darkness recording this. So yeah, the camera's off because there's not much point having it on because you won't see anything anyway. But I hope that doesn't take away from your enjoyment of this lecture, and you'll just be entertained by my dulcet tones by themselves. So now we're on to week 8 of our political economy journey through the 20th and 21st century, where we have touched on the global financial crisis last week, and this week is now exploring the effects and the aftermath of the global financial crisis in a few centers around the world. Of course, we can't deal with absolutely every post GFC situation, and we are containing ourselves to some of the major impacts that will also be relevant for the remainder of this course too. So this is where we are at the moment, and these are the learning objectives for today, as well as the upcoming week in tutorials. And the required readings this week is just only 2 chapters. And like I mentioned last week, I'd really recommend you have a look at Crash by Adam Tooze. It's a very good recap of the global financial crisis, especially for those of us who didn't live through it. I really recommend engaging with this text and others to do with the GFC because it really was a seminal event in our global political economy. Even though I lived through it when I was reasonably young, it made a distinct impression on my life, and it has made a huge impression on the global political economy more generally, with the reverberations still being felt today, which is what we're going to be touching on this week. Now, with the required readings, if you're in book club signed up to the required readings this week, you'll be leading the discussions on them as per normal in the upcoming tutorial this week of week 8. If you had signed up as a book club leader for the week 7 readings, you'll also be leading the discussion of those in this week as well, with the week 8 tutorials. We will just have an expanded book club, although broken up a little bit. You also have hopefully received your marks and feedback for assessment 1 at the moment as well. This week in our tutorials, we will be making some time to go through the approach to the second assessment. So this will include, probably at this stage, just for this particular week, we'll focus on actually how to apply a theoretical framework, because this is something that I believe is probably the most difficult skill in the assessment suite that we have, and it's something that we'll spend a fair bit of time on in tutorials. We'll first introduce it this week in week 8, and then try to build on it as we go. So yeah, this is what the tutorials will look like this coming week. Now let's start with the aftermath of the GFC. And as we discussed last week, the global financial crisis, and this is just a very brief recap, was more or less predicated on the failure of some innovative financial instruments, and particularly the collateral debt obligations. And I did touch on this quite briefly last week, but I just want to emphasize their function again because it is quite important. Generally, the collateral debt obligations, their function was to allow banks to lend to to very poor people, especially in the United States and other Western industrialized countries, at very high interest rates, without fear, basically, that they would default. The trick with these instruments was basically to combine different kinds of loans together in one instrument called the collateral debt obligation. So you might have like safe loans, which might be like taken out by like some rich lawyers or rich doctors to buy a holiday home, for an example. Like you knew that they'd be able to pay you back because of their high earning capacities. Then combined with some loans that bared some risk, like money borrowed by a firm with a decent track record, and then low quality or so-called subprime loans, which was like, for instance, a mortgage taken out by a family who most certainly wouldn't be able to manage to meet the repayments after an initial low interest period expired. And these are all lumped together and divided into small packages, which are called the collateralized debt obligations. and each contain kind of slices of these different loans, with each particular slice paying different interest rates and coming with different default risks. And there's really complex mathematics behind these particular instruments that estimated like how much money the owner of a collateral debt obligation was due on that collateral debt obligation's expiry. And it was so complex, it was said that many of the creators of the instruments also couldn't decipher them themselves. And so these were highly popular with financial markets. And as a result, credit rating agencies also gave them a really strong seal of approval with AAA credit ratings, which meant that was enough for banks to also buy them up in large numbers as well. So these innovative financial instruments, such as collateral debt obligations, were highly popular, and they were complicated instruments that were backed predominantly on credit to a range of people, including people who would struggle to pay back the money from these particular loans. Now, once certain loans within the CDOs couldn't be paid, such as by the subprime loan markets, they started to collapse and rapidly lost value. This then led to the domino effect that resulted in the global financial crisis that we discussed last week. And then this week, we pick up with the responses to the GFC and we start in the United States. And particularly with the Gerthner-Summers plan, which is constructed by Tim Gerthner, the Secretary of the Treasury, and Larry Summers, Director of the National Economic Council. And this started in February 2009 and basically constituted President Obama's $1 trillion package to save the banks from the worthless CDOs in which they were drowning in. And the idea of their plan was quite simple. So to set up in partnership with banks, hedge funds, pension funds, and so forth, a simulated market, so like a fake market for the toxic CDOs that would yield simulated prices, which could then be used to rewrite the bank's accounts. However, what actually happened and what was really intended was that the banks are able to get rid of their toxic CDOs by basically purchasing it themselves. So, for an example, a bank that would be desperate to get a CDO off its balance sheet that it paid $100 for, but that CDO is now worth $7, the Geithner-Summers plan helped them in this endeavor. The bank would immediately be able to set up its own hedge fund, and then using some of the money that the Fed and the US Treasury had lent it in a bailout, the hedge fund then could take part in the Gerthner-Summers plan because it was designed for hedge funds primarily. It would create a new account comprising $100, of which the bank contributes $7. The US Treasury chips in another $7, and the Fed loans it the rest, and then immediately bids $100 for its own collateral debt obligation. So in this manner, it's got rid of the $100 toxic collateral debt obligation once and for all that it paid $100 for. It now bought back from itself for $100, but most of that money, and $93 of that money, was actually from the United States government. So in effect, it only paid $7 for that CDO, which was also in effect a government handout from before. So this is just a very tiny micro example of how this would function with thousands upon thousands of these CDOs. So basically, the federal government in the United States gave enough money to the banks and through the Geithner Summers plan to rebuy these toxic CDOs from themselves, which then reinflated their value and basically got them off the bank's books. So this is one particular way that they helped bail out the United States financial system. And not only in February of 2009 that the Obama administration filled Wall Street sales by engineering a new marketplace for the old derivatives. The medium of exchange in this new marketplace was also a mixture of the old refloated derivatives and also new ones that were based not on poor people's mortgages like before, but on the taxes of those who could not avoid paying them, and which is often the very same poor people. So most of the bank's toxic assets were moved off their account, while the production of new private toxic money took another turn. And a year and a half later, as we'll discuss soon, the Europeans also followed suit with debt issues and bank bailouts, making their contribution to a new wave of high toxic financial products, which again we'll note quite soon. So they basically ended up replacing the toxic CDOs with other similarly toxic financial products. Now, once the bank's balances sheets were cleansed of most of these toxic CDOs, Wall Street used some of the proceeds and some of the bailout money from the various waves of assistance received from the state to pay the government back. Um, but when we're talking about paying the government back, this is quite a gross exaggeration. What they really returned was only a tiny fraction of what the US Treasury and the Fed had given them. So the vast bulk of the bailouts came in the form of a gargantuan but unreported guarantees, and these were never repaid, nor was the gigantic cost of the Gartner summer plans reimbursed. And the banks usually never even acknowledged the hundreds of billion dollars worth of their shares and other assets that were purchased by the Fed under the table in a show of solidarity with Wall Street, which was otherwise known as quantitative easing, which we'll come back to quite a bit later on. And the political economy of these bailouts and guarantees of private capital are very important for us to remember. And I really stress that they're very important for us to remember in this course. Because recall that when we looked at neoliberalism from a common sense perspective, it's generally seen as a political project framed around the freedom of markets. Now, the response to the GFC revealed almost the total opposite: heavy government intervention to save markets from themselves. However, despite most authors and scholars being highly confused about this and even announcing the death of neoliberalism and a return of Keynesianism, this is simply not correct. What we've seen in the GFC is an invigorated response through the very essential tenets of neoliberalism, which is primarily, again, as we've discussed previously, the idea that neoliberalism is the protection of the economy from the politic. The form of this in the 1970s was structural adjustment and the imposition of free markets to smash the organized working classes. But post GFC, it's now looked like directly in a new form of supporting banks, creating new markets for worthless assets, and guaranteeing the stability of financial institutions. Now, please keep this in mind as we will continue to come back to these new bits of evidence that will continue popping up since the global financial crisis that not only reiterates the central purpose of neoliberalism, which is to have institutions such as the state to protect and create markets, but also hints at the move away from the neoliberal paradigm of the post-Washington consensus to something new, which we'll only see fully emerge after the COVID-19 crisis, the Wall Street consensus. Now, heading over to Europe, despite European gloating that the crash 2008 was an Anglo-Celtic crisis and that its own banks had not been taken over by financialization's equivalent of gold fever, the truth soon came out. German banks were caught with an average leverage ratio of 52 euros borrowed to every €1 of their own funds, which is a ratio worse even than that racked up by Wall Street or London City. Even the most conservative and stolid state banks, such as the Lands and Banken, proved bottomless pits for the German taxpayer. And it was a similar story in France, where the banks had to admit that they had at least 33 billion euros invested in collateralized debt obligations. To this sad sum, also, we have to add the European banks' exposure to the indebted Eurozone states, which amounted nearly $1 trillion, to Eastern Europe, which was more than 150 billion, to Latin America, more than 300 billion, and to bad Icelandic debts, around 70 billion euros. The European Central Bank, the European Commission, which is the European Union's kind of effective government, and the member states rushed in to do for European banks what the US administration had done for Wall Street. Only there were two profound differences. The first was that the euro is nothing like the dollar, because while the dollar remains the world's reserve currency, the Fed and the US Treasury can write blank checks safe in the knowledge that it will make very little difference to the value of the dollar, at least in the medium term, which is very different for the European currency. The second difference relates to the Eurozone's problematic architecture, and especially the way that through its member states are bound by a common currency, their public debts are strictly separate, and banks are the responsibility of member states alone. Now, within this institutionally problematic framework, the European Central Bank and the European Commission struggled to contain the banking crisis. Between 2008 and 2009, they socialized the bank's losses and turned them into public debt. And meanwhile, the economy of Europe went into a very deep recession, as was expected. Now, suddenly at this stage, hedge funds and banks in Europe alike had something of an epiphany. Why not use some of the public money that they had been getting at this stage from the European Central Bank and the European Commission to restabilize themselves? Why not use that money to bet that sooner or later the strain on public finances, which was caused by the recession on one hand, which depressed the government's tax-taking ability, and also the huge increase in public debt on the other, for which the banks themselves were responsible, wouldn't these strains cause one or more of the Eurozone states to default? And the fact that Euro membership prevented the most heavily indebted countries, such as Greece, Portugal, Ireland, and Spain from devaluing their currencies, which meant they bore the brunt of the combination of debt and recession, led the bankers to train their sights on those countries. So they decided to start betting, and quite small amounts initially, that the weakest link in that chain, Greece, would default. As London's famous bookmakers could not handle multi-billion pound bets, the banks and hedge funds turned to the trusted CDS and insurance policies that pay out the pre-specified amounts of money if someone else defaults. Remember, we talked about CDSs last week. Of course, as the volume of trade in this newer form of private money increased, so the crisis worsened. And there were two reasons for this. First, the rise in the price of CDSs taken out against Greece or Ireland pushed up the interest rates that Athens and Dublin had to pay to borrow, which then pushed them further into the red and towards basically effective bankruptcy. And secondly, the more money that was spent on these CDSs, the more capital was siphoned off, both from corporations seeking loans to invest in productive activity and from states trying to refinance their burgeoning debt. So, in short, the European variant of the bank's bailout basically gave the financial sector the opportunity to mint private money all over again. And once more, that private money was unsustainable and bound to turn into thin ash. And it was bound to turn into another meltdown. And this time it was the public debt crisis, which is also known as a sovereign debt crisis, and the first stirrings of which was felt at the beginning of 2010 in Athens, Greece. Now, almost immediately, the CDSs predicated upon a Greek default exploded, as did the interest rate the Greek state had to pay to borrow in order to refinance its $300 billion debt. Billion euro debt, sorry. By January 2010, it became quite clear that without institutional help, the Greek government would have to default. Informally, the Greek government sought the assistance of the Eurozone, and then German Chancellor Angela Merkel issued her famous nine-cubed speech. She said 9 to a bailout for Greece, 9 to interest rate relief, and 9 to a Greek default. The German government could fathom neither the idea of assisting Greece nor the idea that Greece would default on so much debt held by the French, primarily French and German banks, which is about 75 billion euros and 53 billion euros respectively. So for 5 agonizing months, the Greek state had to borrow at usurious rates, getting deeper and deeper into insolvency, pretending that could weather the storm. Then Mrs. Merkel seemed prepared to let Greece twist in the wind until the very last moment. And that moment came in early May 2010, when the world's bond markets went into something close to the credit crunch of 2008. The Greek debt crisis had panicked investors and caused them not to buy anyone's bonds, fearing a cascading debt similar to that of the global financial crisis. So then in May 2010, the Eurozone, the European Central Bank, and as well as the IMF agreed to extend a 110 billion euro loan to Greece, an interest rate high enough to make it very unlikely that the Greek public purse would be able to repay this new loan as well as the existing ones. Understandably unconvinced that tossing new, expensive loans to an insolvent government that was presiding over an economy in deep recession would somehow magically render it solvent, investors continued to bet on a default by Greece and also by other vulnerable Eurozone states. So a few days later, the European Union announced the creation of what was called the European Financial Stability Facility, otherwise known as the EFSF, which was supposedly a war chest of 750 billion euros that would be on standby just in case another Eurozone member needed assistance with his public debt repayments. Now, this facility was meant to be a temporary fund. As the euro crisis deepened, though, it was decided that it would evolve by 2013 into a permanent institution called the European Financial Stability Mechanism. The idea was to borrow on behalf of the Eurozone 440 billion euros, which would be lent to the illiquid and possibly insolvent member states. Now, the first feature of these is that the EFSF is raising money to bail out not, Ireland, Portugal, Greece, or whoever it might be, but Europe's failing banks. So the predominant reason of money flowing from the EFSF to these countries is to basically reimburse the banks that had lent to these countries in the first place. And the second feature, which is really pertinent here, is that the EFSF is borrowing money by issuing euro bonds. So these bonds that are structured in an identical manner to the previous collateralized debt obligations of the global financial crisis. And remember how we just mentioned that Wall Street's collateral debt obligations, or CDOs, bundled together slices of different mortgages, such as prime and subprime mortgages, which each bear different interest rates and default risks. And also remember that this mix was truly toxic, because if one slice within a given CDO went bad, that increased the risk of a default by the next slice. So it created this domino effect. And so it was with these EFSF bonds issued, for example, for lending to the Irish state, which in December 2010 teetered on the verge of bankruptcy, having failed to find the money to fulfill its promises and repay its private bank's debts. The EFSF loans for Ireland were raised from the money markets by the EFSF on the strength of guarantees issued by the remaining 15 Eurozone states in proportion to their GDP. The total sum raised was then cut up into small packets, each containing a slice that was guaranteed by Germany, another slice guaranteed by France, another by Portugal, and so on and so forth. Now, given that each country had different degrees of credit worthiness, each was charged a different interest rate. And lastly, these packets were sold off as bonds, mostly to Asian investors and Europe's own quasi-bankrupted banks. Now, the markets, after a few days of calmness, took a good look at the EFSF and decided it was merely a stopgap measure and had the exact same problems as the CEOs of the global financial crisis. And so the euro crisis continued with a vengeance. And the reason was, of course, that expensive new loans do not address the deficient state's descent into bankruptcy, and they certainly do nothing for the faulty architecture. Now, we can't go really any more into the full extent of the burning post-GFC crisis in Europe, and I highly recommend looking at Adam Tooze's book Crashed in the required readings on this subject, because now we're going to turn our eyes to another region in the world where the post-global financial crisis set off huge political crises as well. Now, in 2000 and late 2010 and early 2011, the Arab Spring erupted across the Middle East as a long repressed population sought to overthrow authoritarian governments, which were those who were both supported and not supported by Western governments. And the resulting wars and chaos then created huge refugees flows to Europe, which, of course, as we know, was dealing with its own post-GFC austerity political economy crisis. And we'll now address the Arab Spring in brief now. And before we do, we'll look briefly at inequality in the Middle East, which significantly ballooned following the GFC. Now, sharing the pinnacle of the global inequality hierarchy in the world is the Middle East, whose inequality is linked to the concentration of petroleum resources in very small countries with very small populations compared to the region as a whole. This oil, which is exported around the world, is being transformed into permanent financial wealth via financial markets and the international legal system. This sophisticated system is the key to understanding the exceptional levels of inequality in the region. For example, this is one of the many examples we can see. Egypt, which is a country of 100 million people, annually spends on its schools 1% of the combined petroleum revenues of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar, whose populations are tiny. And inequality in the Middle East, too, is also closely connected to the borders laid down by the French and British imperial powers at the end of World War I, as well as to the military protection that Western powers subsequently provided to the oil monarchies. The Middle East bears traces of the logic of colonialism and militarism. It contains reserves of petroleum that would be better kept in the ground to prevent global warming, and its wealth is protected by the extremely sophisticated services of international lawyers and financiers who find ways to put it beyond the reach of the so-called covetous have-nots. And finally, note that the oil monarchies of the Persian Gulf are, together with post-communist Russia, the countries that make the most extensive use of the world's tax havens. The measurement of inequality in the Middle East is complicated, however, by the extreme difficulty of obtaining data about income and wealth, and particularly in the oil monarchies. The evidence suggests that wealth in these states is very highly concentrated, both within the native population and between natives and foreign workers, who make up 90% of the population of Qatar, the Emirates, and Kuwait, and 40% of the populations of Saudi Arabia, Oman, and Bahrain. And there's little doubt that the extreme inequality observed in the Middle East has heightened tensions and contributed to the region's persistent instability. In particular, the wide gap between the reality of the situation and officially proclaimed religious values, which is based on the principles of sharing and social harmony within a community of believers, is quite likely to provoke allegations of illegitimacy and lead to violence. And it did in the end of 2010. On December 16th, 2010, Mohammed Bouazizi set himself on fire in the depressed town of Sidi Bouzid after the police abusively confiscated his scale and vegetables because he lacked a permit. Once the news spread, and this was in Tunisia, relatives and local youth poured into the streets in outrage. The clips of the protests found their way immediately into tweets and Facebook pages, one with 700,000 participants, reaching the international media. Local activists and trade unionists quickly moved in to mobilize on the ground by helping organize more rallies. Within the following 3 weeks, much of central Tunisia was involved in what came to be an uprising, with the citizens demanding jobs, dignity, and freedom. Bouazizi died in the hospital 19 days later, and President Zine El Abidine Ben Ali promises of jobs, reforms, and free elections went unheeded. If anything, his conceding tones emboldened the rebels, who now wanted the president to relinquish power. As the uprising stretched northward to the capital, Tunis, the trade unionists broke rank with the national leadership and staged labor strikes. And then when on January 14th, 2011, protesters filled Bourguiba Boulevard in the capital and the army refused to shoot to kill, Ben Ali and his wife left Tunisia for good. Then in Egypt, activists planned a protest on January 25th, which is National Police Day, to protest the brutal torture and murder of a young man, Khalid Said, by the police for alleged drug use. Tens of thousands marched from some 20 different points in Cairo, flooding the iconic Tahrir Square, and all sorts of people gathered. Security used tear gas, clubs, and rocks, and the government blocked Twitter and the internet, but the protests spread in the following days to provincial cities such as Alexandria, Suez, Mahalla, and Mansoura. Friday, on January 28th, saw the largest crowd in the nation's streets, where protesters fought the security forces, attacked police stations, burned government buildings, and chanted bread, freedom, and justice. As the police retreated from the public scene, protesters occupied Tahrir Square and began to erect tents, while citizens formed popular committees to protect their neighborhoods from potential acts of crime. When the police disappeared, the military took to the streets but signaled neutrality. Now that the protests had grown into a full-fledged uprising, protesters wished to end the 30-year rule of President Mubarak, who was grooming his son to replace him. Mubarak signaled concessions but reaffirmed he was not leaving. Labor strikes then escalated in the country and the balance of street power shifted. 18 days of spectacular uprising, which left over 800 people dead and thousands injured, forced Mubarak to step down on February 11th, 2011. The demise of Tunisia's Ben Ali and Egypt's Mubarak marked a new episode in the politics of the region, a region that had remained captive to the whims of autocratic kings, despotic sheikhs, and lifelong presidents for decades. As if Tunisia and Egypt had shown the path, popular revolts spread like wildfire to some 17 other Arab states, notably Yemen, Libya, Bahrain, Syria, Jordan, and Morocco. However, most of the outcomes were disheartening. Syria sank into a civil war, creating one of the most tragic refugee crises since World War II. Bahrain's revolution stalled by the intervention of Saudi Arabia, and little changed in the power structure in Yemen in favor of the subaltern groups before it turned in 2015 into a front for a civil war between the Houthi rebels and the disposed president Ali Saleh on the one side, and the Saudi regime, which backed the central government on the other. Much of the failures was due to intense geopolitical rivalry and intervention by foreign powers. As the major counter-revolutionary power, the Saudi regime continued to subvert any democratic openings or footprints of Iran that it deemed would jeopardize its hegemony. And to this end Riyadh supported extremist Salafis, provoked sectarian discord, backed an early ISIS, intervened military in Syria and Yemen in 2015, and used financial blackmail to dissuade Egypt's post-coup government from any reconciliation with the Muslim Brotherhood. The United States simultaneously supported and sabotaged the revolutions, depending on which regimes and what interests they were threatening. The United States was caught off guard in Tunisia. It remained ambivalent on Egypt, supported the uprisings in Syria and Libya, but then disavowed revolutionary change in Bahrain and particularly the other Arab oil states. Washington consistently remained subservient to the counter-revolutionary course of its close ally, the Saudi regime, at home and in the region. And what transpired in Tunisia, Egypt, and Yemen, but not Libya, which then developed into a NATO-supported war, were not revolutions in the 20th century sense of rapid and radical overhaul of the states pushed by popular movements from below. Rather, we can maybe call them revolutions. So we were powerful revolutionary movements unleashed on the street that ended up pushing for reform in and through the institution of the incumbent states. So even though the revolutionaries garnered enormous social and street power, they did not rule or succeed in transforming governmental authority. So most state institutions, ministries, police, intelligence apparatuses, judiciary, military, media, business circles, and networks of the old ruling parties continue to operate in varied capacities in these countries. The monumental uprisings in the Arab world, and especially their remarkable politics of the square, expressed in the Tahrir episode, it also inspired a series of occupied movements globally, whose rapid spread in the world reinforced the idea that we have entered a new age of popular politics. On May 2011, tens of thousands marched in Madrid to initiate what came to be known as Los Indignados, the movement of the indignant subalterns who came out in the Puerta del Sol for a month. 6 million Spaniards joined in the protest in their support. In Athens, 100,000 Greeks took to the street, putting out tents in Syntagma Square for weeks. And in the United States, the Occupy Wall Street movement began with the occupation of Zuccotti Park in New York City in September 2011 and soon spread across hundreds of cities. Within the next few months, the global Occupy movements had found echo in Britain, the Netherlands, Mexico, Chile, Russia, India, and later in Turkey's Gezi Park. The persistent effects of the Arab Spring and the foreign interventions in some affected countries, such as Libya and Syria, would then trigger a new crisis that would hit the region in Europe, the refugee crisis. Now, for decades, a borderless Europe had been hailed as an unprecedented accomplishment, dedicated to achieving peace and economic prosperity while championing the ideals of tolerance and human rights. And this ambitious project of unifying European states into an area without internal frontiers has been in the making for over 6 decades. And it's surprisingly been able to withstand many internal and external challenges, such as the collapse of the Soviet Union in its immediate neighborhood, the bloody civil war in former Yugoslavia, the reunification of Germany, 2008 global financial crisis, and then even the more recent UK's referendum on leaving the European Union. However, the recent sudden surge in the number of asylum seekers from the Middle East and North Africa within the last decade has, starkly revealed the weakness of the EU's common asylum policy and challenged its professed commitment to tolerance and the protection of human rights. The refugee crisis produced 2 related challenges for the EU. First, because all EU member states are parties to the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees and its protocols, otherwise known as the Convention of Refugees, they are obligated to offer protection to those who have a reasonable fear of danger on the basis of race, religion, nationality, or political opinion. Different member states of the EU, however, have demonstrated varying levels of commitment to fulfilling their responsibilities under international law. And in addition to revealing many member states' unwillingness to realize their international obligations, the sudden influx of asylum seekers also challenged the organization's internal cohesion. The inability of the EU to act with a unified voice resulted in a number of ad hoc responses from individual member states. And as a result, the EU's ability to weather crises in which member states' core values are challenged was called into question. So, unlike the situation faced by the EU in the past, the refugee crisis saw the emergence of chain link fences across its external borders and the reintroduction of internal border controls, thereby violating one of the main principles of the European project, the free movement of people. Although the Arab Spring brought large numbers of refugees to the European Union as early as 2011, which was mostly via the Mediterranean and Aegean seas, the sudden increase in the number of asylum seekers that occurred in 2015 appears to have taken everyone by surprise. During that year, the EU was faced with over 1.3 million asylum seekers, an increase of 700,000 over the previous year. This influx created a heavy burden on Italy, Greece, and Hungary, which are the main entry points for those arriving from the Middle East and North Africa. And it's important to note that these 3 countries were not only faced with a mass movement of people, but in line with EU regulations, were also expected to process asylum applications of all those crossing their borders. And remember, it was these 3 countries, and maybe not so much Hungary, but especially Italy and Greece, who were facing profound economic challenges at this time. So initially, there were some collective agreements worked through to relocate asylum seekers from the southern European states. In spite of the obstacles in reaching agreement, the two decisions on relocating 160,000 asylum seekers appeared to signal an encouraging development towards some kind of collective crisis management. And despite the willingness of many member states to work towards a common solution, their decision was overshadowed by objections from certain East European member states, as well as the subsequent inconsistent implementation of that decision to relocate 160,000 asylum seekers from these frontline states. And specifically, the relocation decision was taken using a qualified majority vote, which then passed over the objections of the Czech Republic, Hungary, Romania, and Slovakia, which refused to support the proposal. And this objection was consistent with the East European member states' oppositions to EU asylum practices in general. And before joining the EU, the democratization efforts in many Eastern European countries had been shaped significantly by the desire for international integration, and the EU had provided the necessary impetus for the advancement of democracy in the region, since membership in the Club of European States is conditional on a democratic form of government, respect for human rights, and the rule of law. However, while these new entrants adopted the legislation necessary for membership and became functioning democracies by pledging commitment to the same principles of freedom, democracy, and respect for human rights enshrined in the Treaty on European Union, they appeared to maintain core values, and especially on immigration and asylum, that were arguably at odds with the rest of the European Union. So, in short, the inability of states to find a solution that would allow the EU to fulfill its obligations under the Geneva Convention and the Refugee Convention, and at the same time to be acceptable to all member states, led to a delayed response and forced countries to resort to improvised unilateral solutions. So, for instance, Germany on its own decided to allow refugees gathered in Hungary to proceed into its territory and offered to host Syrian refugees regardless of where they first entered the Union. Now, even this did not work, however. Instead of providing much needed relief to peripheral states, Germany's decision resulted in a rise in the number of asylum seekers arriving at the EU's borders with the goal of reaching Germany. And for its part, Hungary welcomed Germany's decision and took advantage of it by allowing thousands of refugees to proceed without registering them or processing their asylum applications. And in response, the German chancellor quickly reversed her earlier decision and claimed that Germany's open door policy did not absolve the peripheral states of the responsibility of processing asylum applications. And soon after, Germany began implementing border controls, document checks, and prevented asylum seekers from entering its territory without proper documentation from the country of first entry. Now, in the rise of massive refugee movements of a scale not seen since the end of World War II, a number of European countries, and particularly in the Balkans, took measures in early 2016 to reinstate border controls by erecting barbed wire border fences, mobilizing their militaries to guard external borders, and augmented their manpower contributions to Frontex, the EU's external borders agency. By February of that year, such measures had brought about the closure of the so-called Balkan route, the route that had been taken by undocumented migrants and refugees who entered the European Union via Greece and slowly moved north through the Balkans until they reached the final destination in one of Europe's northern, more prosperous states. This closure caused an immediate bottleneck on Greece's border with the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, where tens of thousands of migrants converged, waiting for a border reopening. In March 2016, the bottleneck worsened when the European Union and Turkey proceeded to sign an accord, which further escalated control measures. Designed to deter clandestine sea crossings across the Mediterranean and to foil the work of human traffickers, the agreement all but closed the so-called Asian route, the path that was being taken by refugees and other migrants in small inflatable boats from Turkey to the Greek islands in the Aegean Sea. Now, according to the EU Turkey treaty, all undocumented migrants who henceforth arrived on one of these islands would no longer be allowed to travel by ferry to the mainland and from there to a North European destination. Instead, they would now have to apply for asylum on the islands and, if unsuccessful in their bid, would be returned to Turkey. Now, this created a cauldron where the rise of right-wing populism could emerge, which also helped trigger Brexit and the potential dissolution of the European Union, and alongside also the rise of Donald Trump in the United States. And we're now going to talk a little bit more about the far-right rise, partly in the context of the refugee crisis, but also importantly thinking about the post-global financial crisis. Now, beginning with, and I guess staying with the Western political systems we've been looking at so far, the first decade of the 21st century saw the consolidation of both a mainstream right as the main political force and of the populist far right as the long arm of an authoritarian neoliberalism. During this period, center-right parties in Western democratic countries overtook the so-called third way social democracies, such as the Blairite and Clinton governments in the UK and US, respectively, as the main exponent of neoliberalism, combining free market economics with a moderate treatment of questions of migration, multiculturalism, security, and law and order, and also feeding on the climate of the war on terror that was preoccupied with borders and security. This centre right, however, also held commitment to multilateralism and substantial curbs on national sovereignty. This period also saw the strengthening of the populist radical right based on its winning formula of radicalization of the question of migration and anti-welfare neoliberalism. The populist right had an ambiguous relationship with transnational neoliberalism, which helped legitimize neoliberal economics while nominally defending sovereignty against globalization. Yet the active securitization of the international system at the time also meant that the Western populist radical right was in many ways in tune with many major global trends. And this early period saw the consolidation of a mass-based mainstream right in other regions of the world too, often with a religious underpinning. So, for example, in Turkey and India, political religious movements, such as those who are Muslim and Hindu respectively, challenged the hold of secular bureaucratic and political elites and their associated economic interests, putting forward a strong agenda of economic liberalization. Now, the GFC radically challenged the relationship of the mainstream right with transnational neoliberalism while providing new openings to populism in the global north and south. While the mainstream center right stuck by neoliberal economics in the global north with the crisis, trying to counter the effects of the crisis through austerity measures, the populist radical right saw an opening to broaden its audience by addressing questions of economic as opposed to only cultural discontent. Without fully embracing redistribution, it started distancing itself from outright neoliberalism while linking more explicitly its cultural chauvinism to the economic challenges of the time, for example, by presenting immigration as a factor of economic injustice. The only remnant of doctrinaire authoritarian neoliberalism in this period was with the United States Tea Party, arguably, which, as supported as it was by powerful business and corporate interests, tried to revamp more discredited neoliberalism as an anti-status populism. Now, these trends reached a kind of inflection point in the early second half of 2010s, which saw a radical reversal of the balance between the formerly mainstream and the populist right. In English-speaking democracies, populist insurgency swept aside the establishment of two neoliberal conservative parties in 2016, leading to the imposition of formerly marginalized ideas like economic protectionism and tariffs for Trump in the United States, and emphasis on state-led regional policies in favor of left-behind areas for post-Brexit conservatives in the United Kingdom. In both cases, heterodox and post-neoliberal economics translated into the economic field a strong preoccupation with national and cultural sovereignty. And similar regimes were erected in Poland and Hungary, where conservative parties adopted a strong populism, which was directed against liberal elites at home and abroad, and especially in Brussels, combined with interventionist and welfare-based policies. Now, in Latin America, as well as the mainstream right, in many cases, a direct hire air of authoritarian traditions and anti-democratic political, economic, and military establishments has been infiltrated by populism, which served these parties to assault the governments of the so-called pink tide at the time for their failures and corruption, with Brazil's Bolsonaro being the most prominent example, but cases also in Argentina and Chile. The populist right imposed itself as a new paradigm of right-wing politics in the region, which drew heavily on the 1990s Western European winning formula of cultural authoritarianism and populist economic anti-statism. Now, the effects of the GFC in this development is really important. And we can kind of consider the GFC as kind of a crisis conjuncture, which is suggestive of Antonio Gramsci's ideas of an organic crisis. So for Gramsci, the distinct quality of an organic crisis, as opposed to the recurring, series of conjunctural ones that are endemic to capitalism, is that it creates conditions whereby the traditional ways of ensuring bourgeois hegemony collapse. And more specifically, when the long-standing connections and loyalties of different social layers with their traditional political representative breaks down, affording an opportunity for alternative political forces. This is arguably what has been unique about this crisis from others over the course of the history of the post-war liberal international order. In this case, where a systemic economic crisis mutates into a systemic political one, even after the former has been stabilized. And consequently, while the economic impact of the 2007-2008 crisis, in terms of falls of economic growth, trade flows, capital liquidation, and unemployment, was serious, which caused widespread, if internationally uneven, social misery, the challenge to the existing forms of political rule within some of the major capital states and the international geopolitical underpinnings of the liberal order can only be explained through a focus on the co-constitutive political roots of the organic crisis. And further, the evidence of an organic crisis is also found in the scope of debate that invokes moral, social, and cultural concerns as much as political questions, that provides space for marginalized voices to become more widely heard and for challenges to appear against a hegemonic common sense. And as Gramsci would also say here, the morbid symptoms of a dying social order that Gramsci referred to and which appeared to be evident after the GFC have not yet produced such a political and a geopolitical transformation as may be expected, though the rise of China does suggest that some kind of geopolitical transformation has been in process since that time. But it doesn't mean that the social bases of politics within Western liberal democracies and the dominant ideo-political cleavages therein have not been altered. And importantly, the successful implanting of far-right parties, as in some cases parties of the government, such as Trump in the US, the Brexit Conservatives, the League in Italy, or the main party of opposition, such as the RN in France and the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, are perhaps sufficient evidence of organic crisis according to Gramsci's definition. And it was the political decisions, arguably, that were taken in response to the crisis over the GFC and thereafter at multilateral forums such as that typified by the G20 in Washington, D.C. and London, for example, as well as decisions at regional and national levels that were to provide the kind of dynamic that propelled the far-right surge after the opportunity opened up by the crisis itself. And consequently, a crisis of neoliberal financial capitalism was resolved through a co-coordinated and US orchestrated form of state intervention that rescued most of the North Atlantic financial sector. And the social layers that were and are reproduced through and who benefit most from it was politically framed by the far right and also by some left populists as well, as one set of cosmopolitan political elites saving another set of financial cosmopolitan elites. And as the salvage operation quickly shifted gear towards austerity as neoliberalism reasserted itself through the spectre of public debt and the opportunity of rupture had passed, the crisis of the political legitimacy of elites only deepened. And this political crisis of elites after the GFC was also compounded by the corresponding deployment of what was at the time considered a highly unorthodox monetary policy, that of quantitative easing, or QE, which I very briefly mentioned at the start of the lecture. And basically, this policy was based on central banks buying government debt or bonds and other financial assets as a mean to inject liquidity into financial markets and consequently helped stimulate private sector investment and in a way that did not deepen the fiscal deficit. The result was rather anemic economic growth alongside an increase in asset price inflation, which served to increase the structural inequality produced in the neoliberal era, with the financial and rentier layers, who were most responsible for causing the crisis, benefiting most from quantitative easing rather than the wider economy and the general population. So, like stock indices, and especially in the US, grew at a much faster rate than wages. So, although QE did help stabilize employment, this was at a significant cost, and its downsides were on accentuating inequality were stark, considering that other fiscal options could have been activated. And quantitative easing's impact on inequality also, concentrated on financial vultures, which consequently added fuel to the fire of the far right's populist ire. And the fact that such policies were based on decisions taken by unelected expert and technocratic monetary authorities also added to far right objections. Now, the GFC crisis also revealed a distinct set of contours that related to globalization that also contributed to the growth of far-right narratives surrounding it. So first, this concerned the geopolitical relations and the distinct geoeconomic structure that world economic growth over the neoliberal era had been organized around. And this was mainly concerning the incorporation of China into the capitalist economy, and with it, and its unprecedented rise as a global manufacturing hub was the backbone of this arrangement, and specifically the coupling of the American economy with that of China. And such an arrangement had provided the basis of inflation-proof growth, as the low-cost production of manufactured goods in China were exported back to the US and the wider West, and providing a new location for new lines of accumulation of Western capital after the crises of the 1970s. The era from China's openings in 1978 to 2008 saw a massive shift of capital and manufacturing power from Western economies to China and East Asia more broadly. And while this resulted in cheap consumer goods being exported back to the West that were affordable to large sections of the wage earning class, which also helped to suture the growing socioeconomic inequality and class polarization within Western societies through cheap consumerism, it also established a crisis of overproduction in the world economy. Um, and in spite of the strictures that were associated with its accession to the World Trade Organization in 2001, China's insertion into the world economy produced a surge in overcapacity in key sectors that, while helping to sustain employment and living standards for millions of migrant workers and consequently political stability and the security of the Communist Party in China, has also exercised deflationary pressure and undercut production in the West industrial heartlands. And such developments simmered below the political surface up into the global financial crisis, but rapidly developed into something of a geopolitical significance thereafter. And this backdrop was really central to the narrative of Trump's election campaign in the US and the nationalist political economy that was central to it. So in by kind of obscuring the real material and class causes of the GFC, Trump blamed the so-called Beltway elites or the swamp for undermining American power and prestige, as well as for making concessions to China, which he also blamed as directly responsible for America's social and economic ills. That China and the manner of its integration into the capitalist world economy over the preceding decades was implicated in the causes of the crisis and in the origins and reproduction of the socioeconomic pathologies that characterized many Western societies over this period was not inaccurate. But this was a process that had much more mixed consequences and revealed the organic and constitutive contradictions of capitalist uneven and combined development rather than either the singular duplicity and corruption of the American political elite or the machinations and dishonesty of the Chinese party state. However, that China and Chinese people had massively benefited from the workings of the global economy over the 3 decades prior to 2008 and beyond, in contrast to significant parts of American society and sections of the working middle classes in particular, did help Trump frame the crisis and its resolution in such racialized and geopolitical terms. And what we can kind of take from this discussion of the geopolitical economy of the GFC and the political economy that emerged from it is that the far-right political surge after 2008 across several Western liberal democracies was a product of a political economic context uniquely advantageous to its kind of politics. And really, such a context and its enabling dynamics is comparable to those earlier conjunctions that had provided good fortune for the far right in history. The context of the global financial crisis conjuncture was determined by three interconnected dimensions. And first, we had the product of the long-term political economy of neoliberalism and the specific form of uneven and combined development that it established, the geopolitical and wider spatial character of capital accumulation, the political institutional structures bequeathed by it, and its impact on class formation in advanced capitalist countries, and especially those where neoliberalism had advanced furthest, all contributed to a political economy defined by the fragmentation and weakening of organized labor and the reintroduction of more widespread socioeconomic insecurities connected to the globalization of production. And further, within this longer term reproduction of neoliberalism, the far right had well established itself as the primary oppositional force to its globalizing and spatial aspects. And secondly, the global financial crisis detonated the contradictions established within the neoliberal era as the combination of the drive for capital accumulation, the weakening of public and democratic collectivized oversight of the economy, and the disruptions associated with the integration and rise of China exploded through 2007 to 2008. Bringing out into the open, exposing the limits and bankruptcy of neoliberal centrism, the political ground shifted towards an anti-elitist populism. And this brings us really to the third and final element in the political economy brew that produced the far-right surge. And while this populist turn involved significant forces on the left that, in some places were momentarily ascendant if they were, structurally weak, such as Syriza in Greece, the more generalized trend had been its far-right inflection. Here, the implementation of a set of policies in response to the crisis if not, universally characterized by austerity, that only served to reinforce the socioeconomic pathologies of uneven development and inequality, while the elite bargain that had been party to the crisis remained in place. And so the dismantling of collectivized welfare provision and the socioeconomic costs disproportionately falling on the non-metropolitan poor facilitated a rebooting of a socially embedded anti-immigrant racism, itself spatially specific, that further revealed the nationalist and territorialized dimensions that rippled through large sections of society across the West. Now, let us turn to the one of the major regional manifestations of the far-right surge in the United States. The election of the property magnate and television personality Donald Trump to the American presidency in November 2016 is perhaps kind of the watershed moment in the upswelling of support for far-right politics since the GFC. In an election campaign which was back then dominated by, racist and anti-immigrant outbursts and the articulation of a white nationalist platform that attacked the preceding decades of neoliberal globalization, or what Trump described as globalism, and framed around the slogan "Make America Great Again," Trump appeared as a radical anti-establishment insurgent outside of the traditional political class, and which was then well tuned into a distinct far-right ideo-political current which was present within American politics since the late 1960s. A mixture of, white grievance, opposition to the federal managerialist state, liberal internationalism, and a self-help individualism which is based on privileging private property holders through deregulation and low taxation. And Trump's self-depiction as a populist anti-elitist outsider was in part to the initial hesitancy of the Republican Party so-called country club establishment to embrace him, as they originally favored Jeb Bush, the former governor of Florida and the son and brother of two former Bush presidents. But in spite of his singular personality traits, Trump's politics aligned well with significant sections of the Republican base, as polling demonstrated throughout 2016 in the lead up to the election of that year. Now, there was a few different aspects of Trump's approach in the election and also his presidency, which we can summarize through different categories of the economy, on race, ideology, and the political. So first, let's consider the economy. His major campaign theme, which was "Make America Great Again," was in fact in part, a promise to revitalize the economy and create more jobs for Americans, which was a clear reference to the wage stagnation and overwork of recent decades, as well as people's concerns for the economic future of themselves and their kids. He also promised to foster an environment where more and more Americans could become richer, which would presumably help reduce household debt and income equality and enable more Americans to achieve the American dream, or that was at least the assumption that flowed from the Make America Great Again economic platform. And even just before, or rather, sorry, the exit polling from Election Day demonstrated that 2/3 of the people worried that the economy was in poor shape. They flocked to Trump, and nearly 3/4 of those who thought the economy was in good shape went to Hillary Clinton. So Trump had clearly seized on an issue of great concern to the public, which is around economic issues. And further, although the differences are not as large in terms of which income groups tended to support Trump and Clinton, he won nearly 2/3 of the votes of people who felt that life in the next generation would be worse than today. And if we put it a bit differently, it was not class per se that mattered as much as people's perception about the prospects of moving to a different class, that is, intergenerational mobility. Trump also won roughly 2/3 of the votes of people who believe that international trade took away American jobs, which is another major campaign theme for him. Now, in terms of race, and insofar as race and immigration are concerned, Trump promised to crack down on immigration, and mainly by preventing Muslims who so-called posed a terrorist threat from entering the country, and to build a wall along the Mexican border to keep out immigrants who were so-called criminals or intended to take American jobs, as his rhetoric noted. His pitch built on, America's recent fear of terrorism, which we spoke about last week. It's much longer history of racism and people's misunderstanding of the real causes of unemployment and economic hardship for the middle and working classes. But it all worked to his benefit, this rhetoric. Now, in terms of ideology, this was also important. Trump appealed to the conservatives with considerable effect, winning 81% of the conservative vote. And it's worth mentioning that in exit polling, 35% of those polled said they were conservatives, while only 26% said they were liberal, which was a manifestation of the rightward shift in American politics, which we had noted. And equally telling was Trump's appeal to Christians and especially white evangelicals, who supported him by an overwhelming margin, 81% to 16%. Despite the declining influence of the so-called moral majority, the religious right still remains a powerful force in American politics today that he was able to exploit. Now, politically, Trump, who was a self-professed anti-establishment outsider, promised to overcome political polarization and gridlock and get government in Washington back on the right track because he knew how to drain the swamp, or so his rhetoric went. And in a similar vein, by using his own fortune to finance his campaign, he claimed that he could not be bought by corporate or other interests that had corrupted the political system through exorbitant spending on political campaigns and lobbying. These arguments seemed to resonate with voters too. The public dissatisfaction with gridlock in Washington was evident in the voting, and 58% of those who felt dissatisfied or angry with the federal government went for Trump, while 76% of those who felt enthusiastic or satisfied with it supported Clinton. And Trump tried to capitalize on events during Obama's presidency that finally turned political polarization into gridlock. And and this was also kind of reflected in exit polling at the time as well. Nearly 90% of those who disapproved of Obama's presidency voted for Trump, while 84% of those who approved of his presidency voted for Hillary Clinton. And 83% of those who believed that the Affordable Care Act, which was one of Obama's crucial healthcare platforms, which was also a lightning rod that energized the Tea Party, had gone too far, supported Trump, while 78% of those who believed it hadn't gone far enough supported Clinton. Now, lingering concerns about the financial crisis also came into play here. 78% of those who worried about the financial situation of the country, that it was worse than it was 4 years ago, voted for Trump. Yeah, so overall, kind of Trump's victory at this stage, which we might possibly see again, was teamed with irony. Even though many mainstream Republicans opposed his candidacy, Trump's ascendance was partly the culmination of forces set in motion a long time ago by Republicans themselves. One was the Republicans' aggressive and heavily financed advocacy of neoliberalism, which contributed so much to policies during and after the Reagan years, which we've noted previously, including the easing of regulatory oversight of banking and financial services that led to the financial crisis that helped propel Trump to the White House. Another was the racism associated with the Republican Southern strategy, which also benefited Trump's campaign. And in fact, some Republicans, including both former Bush presidents and Mitt Romney, were so appalled during the campaign by his racism and xenophobic remarks that they repudiated him. And several big Republican donors, such as the Koch brothers, among them, decided to spend their money on Republicans running for legislative office instead of him. And the ranks of the Republican Party were never so divided over a presidential candidate in the last half century. So this is kind of some of the political economy points of the Trump move to power in the context of the far-right rise after the global financial crisis. And now we're going to turn our eyes to the next region of our journey, which is back to Europe, to the UK. And in a similar way that Trump's election was framed as a revolt of the so-called left behinds or the white working class, so the decision by a majority of British and strictly speaking English and Welsh people to vote to leave the European Union in June 2016 was greeted as a similar event as that of Trump. Now, this accounting of the Brexit vote only reveals a partial truth about Brexit, but in its class, racial, and spatial dimensions, the Brexit vote does share something in common with the context and forces that elected Trump. So thus, the long-term development trend within Britain's neoliberal political economy, the impact of the GFC, and then what followed were also crucial in shaping the politics of Brexit and the 2016 referendum outcome. Brexit revealed the strength of far-right ideological political currents that had been a constituent, if contradictory, part of the neoliberal hegemony since 1979, but in a way that did not see the successful breakthrough of a far-right party, but rather the playing out of the contradictions within the principal political representatives of the British capitalist class, the Conservative Party. It was also greeted across the liberal commentariat like that of Trump's election as a unique crisis of post-war liberal internationalism. And replicating developments after Trump was elected, authorities recorded a significant spike in racist incidents and attacks. The Brexit vote was also like that of Trump's electoral victory, an outcome decades in the making. And importantly, if we start thinking about the history here for a little, Britain's EU membership had become a major source of division within the Conservative Party as far back as the early 1990s, and was a major factor in the deposing of Thatcher in 1990, and then dogged the premiership of John Major until 1997. This kind of Eurosceptic wing of the Tory party reflected a combined hyper neoliberal and nationalistic current within it, an political orientation at loggerheads with the dominant fractions of the British capitalist class, and most pronounced in the United Kingdom Independence Party, or UKIP, that was founded in the early 1990s as a single-issue anti-European federalist party. It quickly morphed into a more openly nationalist party by the mid-2000s, and especially so after Nigel Farage became leader in 2006. And UKIP benefited from the collapse in support for the extreme right British National Party, and then became the most significant political force opposing Britain's EU membership and the flow of migrants into the UK, and especially after the citizens of the new EU members from Central Eastern European countries were allowed to enter the UK labour market from 2004, which also obviously increased after the refugee crisis of 2015. Now, under Farage's leadership at UKIP, it became a major source of pressure on the Conservative Party, the Tories, as many of its policy positions overlapped with a significant part of the Conservative Party's membership and social base, and some of its MPs in terms of social authoritarianism, such as support for the restoration of the death penalty, alongside a supercharged neoliberalism, and which also rested on seeing the EU, like Thatcher did, as a form of centralised and bureaucratic state-like entity. And consequently, UKIP, alongside its allies within the Tory party, was the dominant articulation of the neoliberal far right in Britain from the mid-2000s up until the 2016 referendum. Now, like its American cousin, Britain's neoliberal economy was defined by both its geographical unevenness and class inequality. A development model over-dependent on credit-induced growth based on a vibrant housing sector as a driver of consumption, Britain's economy was anchored in London and the southeast property market, a shrinking manufacturing sector, and the cosmopolitan financial centre of the City of London, which is now an offshore location of America's financial empire. To this spatial unevenness was matched growing class inequality as increasing sectors of the economy were low wage and low skilled, and this was before the crisis hit. Indeed, under New Labour, the early 2000s Blair Labour government, while public funding tried to plug the gap produced by the dearth of private investment in the North and Midlands, which is where the manufacturing base of the UK is situated, after the decimation of these manufacturing heartlands in the Thatcher government, the fundamental problems of Britain's lopsided, unbalanced economy in spatial and sectorial terms intensified. Now, with the UK moving into recession in 2008, the economy experienced then its deepest recession since the 1930s. The UK economy shrunk by 5% in December 2009 year on year, with GDP falling by 6% since early 2008. And unlike other recessions, and considering the length and depth of this particular economic contraction, unemployment didn't actually rise by that significant levels. The main issue here and how the crisis paid out, the post-GFC crisis in the UK, was a dramatic fall in wages, with real wages falling by about 8 to 10% between 2008 and 2014, which was one of the highest across the major capitalist economies. And it was the impact of austerity that was to do the most damage to Britain's social fabric after 2008, and which accentuated its highly uneven and lopsided political economy as the divides, spatial and class, between London and the southeast and the rest of the country expanded. The public spending cuts had a disproportionate impact on traditional Labour voting areas in the north, as well as London too, in part because of the high proportion of public sector workers employed in these areas. And the regional and north-south polarization of the post-crisis economy was also caused by the Bank of England's quantitative easing policy that was introduced in March 2009, and again, which mirrored very closely the quantitative easing policy that we saw in America. Now, this was also focused on pumping liquidity into the financial sector after the credit squeeze caused by the GFC. The quantitative easing helped stabilize the financial sector, and thus the political economy that had in effect caused the crisis also created asset price inflation, and especially those of richer households clustered in and around London. And this is by as much as like £322,000 per household. These, already highly wealthy households gained in wealth from this quantitative easing policy from the United Kingdom government. And this government policy after 2008 ended up reproducing very uneven and iniquitous consequences that, intentional or not, punish the poorest people in the poorer regions of the UK, people in places that would exercise an important role in the Brexit referendum of 2016. And the significance of these trends in relations to a political context of Brexit was that while they reflected the continuation of longer term development pattern, the post-crisis conjuncture was crucial. It took political agency and a referendum campaign to make these trends politically significant and causal, but understood as a conjuncture. The 2008-16 period could be seen to reflect a period where the antagonisms and contradictions that had been brewing within Britain for decades fused into a rupture. Now, by the time of the referendum, a far-right framed understanding of immigration and the EU occupied a significant part of the electoral terrain across Britain. And this widespread perception really consisted of, firstly, immigration levels were too high, such that in many areas of England in particular, most of which voted leave in the referendum, there was a widespread misperception that the proportion of immigrants in the local population was far higher than it actually was, which reflected years of exaggerations and falsehoods spouted by the right-wing press. Two, that the UK government could not control migrant numbers because of its EU membership. And the third perception was that governments had not been honest about migration policy. And given that migration and free movement numbers had ballooned after 2012, and which peaked in 2015, in the context of austerity and the absence of a convincing alternative framing of the migration and EU nexus, and an explanation of the causes of the crisis and a different way of dealing with its consequences, the 2015 manifesto under Ed Miliband's leadership largely was quite equivocal on this. And it's not difficult to see why a major part of British political debate was taking place on so-called UKIP territory. And obviously, this didn't mean that the majority of people were now UKIP supporters, as we will briefly note, and nor that the referendum result was a certainty. But the combination of like the structural economic forces, the policy miscalculations, the intervention of the GFC, and then the austerity, and then the complicities of both the Labour and Conservatives, in this debate, and then finally the short-sighted calculations and mistakes of the Prime Minister David Cameron, all brought Britain to the precipice of June 2016 and the referendum vote. By then, and so, at this stage, two of the major, if not kind of the primary goals of the far right were now in sight, without the British far right, coming close to being a significant electoral force, let alone getting a sniff of actually getting political power, as we saw in other countries such as the US. Now, the significance of the anti-immigrant and specifically anti-Muslim racism that characterized much of the Leave campaign, and the fact that the official Tory-led Leave campaign was far from robust or consistent in distancing itself and condemning this propaganda, all contributed to not only a highly toxic and polarizing campaign, but one where such public racism was unprecedented in recent times. And in the same way that racists, neo-fascists, and white supremacists of all stripes were supportive and joyful of Trump's candidature, so it was in the UK that such people were enthused by, supportive of, and more publicly visible than at any other time in recent history. Such an atmosphere was also conducive to provoking racist violence, which is a defining characteristic of the kind of politics usually associated with fascism. And so the assassination of the Labour MP and campaigner for refugee rights, Jo Cox, by a white supremacist on June 16, 2016, suggested that fear-mongering and public racism had contributed to the murder. And although this was a single event, the fact that reports of racist incidents, including that included violence, spiked in the weeks after the referendum result was announced, also provides added weight to this conclusion. And so this nationalist, anti-Muslim, and anti-immigrant racist current was a main feature of the Leave campaign, and it was indicative of a traditional far-right politics, and it sat, not always comfortably and not always consistently with the economic dimensions of the campaign that talked of liberating Britain from EU regulations and bureaucratic rules, and thus unleashing the potential of a global Britain. The far-right tinge campaign that focused on controlling, securing borders, and vilifying immigrants, and the economic, social, and cultural changes that were or associated with deployed the spectre of the world outside Britain as a threat. That contrasted with a supercharged neoliberal current that spoke of global opportunities, further deregulation, and an embrace of instability, rupture, and dynamism. So this was the political economy of Brexit. And we don't have a huge amount of time really to go into Europe. And I know I've already been speaking for quite a long time now, but I just want to trace some brief contours of the post-GFC rise of the far right in Europe as well, which was certainly not homogenous and varied across the different countries, but we'll try to trace some broader outlines which we try to understand through a political economy lens. Now, by the early 2000s, Europe, far-right parties had already become a mainstay of most West European party systems, and they started to gain a significant and growing level of the vote share. And in some cases, such as Austria, Italy, Denmark, and the Netherlands, had actually participated in or offered parliamentary support for governments. And the two crises that dominated the international politics of the EU and Eurozone countries in particular, which is the GFC, that morphed then into the Eurozone sovereign debt crisis after 2009, and then the crisis that emerged over 2014, 2015 in terms of the refugee crisis, then certainly reinforced the trend in strengthening the ideo-political forces of the far right, even if they did not produce the kind of major rupture or far right breakthrough that compared in significance to what happened with Britain and Brexit and the United States with Trump. So thus, in spite of the kind of acute tensions that developed between several member states of the Eurozone, much of which reflected an upsurge of far-right infused nationalist and race invective, a form of unity and geopolitical stability ultimately held. So far, at least. Now, the impact and management of these two crises we noted, the GFC crisis and the refugee crisis within several countries, and the undermining of democratic voices, procedures, and representation over these years by the actions of EU institutions and some leading member states has been deeply disturbing and to a significant degree had worked to further reinforce the anti-EU populist and nationalist and anti-migrant politics associated with far-right political currents. And consequently, even in recognizing the success of the EU and its leading member states, and especially Germany, in managing these crises, there has been some noteworthy developments and in some respects advances for the European far right over this period that reveal the constitutive contradictions within the EU neoliberal project rooted in its uneven and combined character. And this is really revealed in these following points. That firstly, we have the spatialized geopolitical unevenness in its working and reproduction in socioeconomic and political terms, given the uneven levels of growth across the Eurozone, its deleterious consequences in increasing levels of inequality between and within its member states, and the dominance of Berlin in its overall political leadership and material well-being. And also, secondly, the combined character of its political institutionalization as reflected in the so-called pooled sovereignty across the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and its member states. And decision-making that contrasts with both the political and judicial limits of the democratic sovereignty of the citizens within its individual member states, and how political legitimacy continues to be spatially and institutionally limited. Combination of these kind of reveals then that not only in the disarticulation of Eurozone economic relations from democratic policies, but actively reifies kind of national and spatial framings of such contradictions that have been especially acute in the context of the evolving Eurozone crisis since 2009. And so the absence of a systematic rupture is hardly a cause of celebration with the EU, or even a vindication of the political and economic underpinnings of the Eurozone. And in this respect, the economic structure and the political institutionalization of the Eurozone and the way it has affected the workings of European capitalism over the last 2 decades has really served to enable far-right ideopolitical currents. And this has been particularly evident in the centrist kind of authoritarian turn that characterized the responses of the principal sources of power within the Eurozone to the crisis itself. And in exposing the fundamental contradiction between its universal monetary space and its political democratic fragmentation, and especially during the crisis, the widespread democratic opposition to the workings and policies of EU authorities as evidence in elections during this period, the crisis was like resolved in a sense through a deepening of these contradictions, through a deepening of the EU monetary and fiscal sovereignty and the sidelining of national parliaments and democratic processes, and consequently a crisis that offered the opportunity for a fundamental and necessary rethinking of European integration instead resulted in the consolidation and strengthening of the rule of financial capital and the supranational intergovernmental legal and technocratic procedures that had helped produce the conditions that caused the crisis in the first place. And this kind of deepening of what we might call the authoritarian tendencies within the EU project that the crisis helped propel also revealed the distinct class interests that the Eurozone ultimately realizes. And the surveillance and intervention of national budgets that ensures that democratic possibilities for altering or reshaping the social relations between capital and labor are effectively vetoed by the European institutions. And further, the content of the EU's so-called austerity therapy after the global financial crisis, and at least as how it concerns the rights of workers, appears to trounce their rights as guaranteed by the Union's Charter of Fundamental Rights. And that it's not been possible for organized labor organizations to challenge and overturn such policies by appeals to the European Court of Justice, merely kind of evidences the closing down of any kind of way of defending rights in practice. So furthermore, the gutting of democratic power within the EU is reflected in its authoritarian neoliberal turn, especially after the crisis, and this has been really a gift to the ideology of the far right, based as it is on both targeting the EU as the source of blame and through the resultant marginalization and weakening of elected national parliaments, just what the far right wants to do, and also saw the EU authorities fulfill the ambitions of transnational capital. And such developments in the revival and strengthening of the far right have been most evident in France, Italy, and Greece, and also within Germany itself. In France, Marine Le Pen of what was then the Front National, and then since 2018, the Rassemblement National, or the RN government party, got through to the final round of the 2017 presidential election and was also close to power most recently in the French elections of this year. And with the collapse in support of both of the two traditional parties of the French Fifth Republic on the right and left, the RN and Marie Le Pen's RN has come to occupy a position as the unofficial opposition and was the secondary party to the government of Emmanuel Macron's En Marche, which has obviously changed now with the win by the leftist coalition in France, which might then signal a slightly different turn for Europe. But even in that is a very interesting case in itself, which we can't really talk about now. But even just last week, even though many of you would probably have heard that this coalition of leftist parties had won the vote in France and had won the opportunity to form government. Just last week, Macron had denied their candidate, the prime minister candidate from this coalition, and it seems that it was we're in the stage of a neoliberal passive revolution in France by Macron to ensure the continuation of conservative and status quo power, which is very, very interesting in itself, which we unfortunately don't have time to go in now, but might be something that we speak about perhaps in our last week. Now, in Italy, at this time after the GFC, a similar process had played out, and we saw the evaporation of support for centrist currents on the left and right, which resulted firstly in the rise of the populist Five Star movement in 2013, and then Matteo Salvini's far-right League Party that produced the M5S League coalition government in 2018, and this helped cement the League's status as a dominant force on the Italian right. And then over this time, Salvini's personal popularity had shot up in such a way that by 2019, some opinion polls indicated that he was the most popular politician in Italy. Now, in Greece, which we've already spoken about, where the impact of the Eurozone crisis and and specifically the consequences of austerity conditions imposed on it after 2010 were felt so severely in exchange for a series of financial bailouts to prevent a sovereign default and Greece's exit from the Eurozone. This has had catastrophic social consequences that resulted in upsurge of support for an explicitly neo-fascist party that was implicated in anti-immigrant violence and murder. And finally, in Germany itself, which is really the most successful and powerful economy within the Eurozone, the political tensions involved in its management of and exposure to the crisis has helped revive for the first time since World War II, a major far-right party in national politics, the Alternative for Deutschland, AfD. And after the 2017 general election, with the Social Democrats opting to continue in a grand coalition with the Christian Democrats, the AfD became the country's main party of opposition in the Bundestag. And even just last week, and again, maybe something we will talk about in our last week of classes, the AfD have also won significant elections in Germany in the past week. Now, this is where we unfortunately have to leave the post-GFC politics of Europe. I know we've spoken about a lot, but even in doing so, really haven't covered that much. So I really encourage you all, please have a look at the required readings, the recommended readings. I can't get through every single potential nuance of every topic in our what should be 1 hour lectures, but are often a little bit longer. So I'd really encourage you to look at these readings to really grapple with the political economy that developed after the GFC. Next week, we'll progress through the 21st century to the next major crisis, that of COVID-19. So I look forward to seeing you all there, and also very much look forward to seeing you in tutorials this week. Thank you very much, everyone.